Let's come to what is the beginning of the close of the year. This is presentation 48 out of 52. We're looking at the Parayana, a term that I have not just simply coined, but have brought back into play and into the English language from an ancient usage of the word in Sanskrit. In the remembered discourses of the historical Buddha, the major focus of his discourses was to impart a sense of the strategy of disinvolvement in the world to begin to hone a quality of concentration. In Sanskrit, that concentration is called dhyana, D-H-Y-A-N-A, dhyana. And it is a yana, it is a way, dhyana is a way of concentrating by eliminating the superfluous and bringing into focus what remains. And the tremendous accuracy, not only of the Buddha, but of his method that he was imparting, that he was teaching, is that the extraneous begin to include almost everything down to a single point. And in Sanskrit, that single last point is called ekagrata. It is the last graspable, most minute vestige of focus. When the method perseveres, when the extraneous elimination perseveres, that ekagrata winks out. That space of no focus instantly shows that it is already vast spontaneously. And the word for that was nirvana. Just as it winks out, what winks back in to play is the world as it is, but seen with a further dimension. The dimension of a differential consciousness that knows that the context of whatever occurs, however minute, however complex, its context is this nirvana, vast, unlimited openness. So that the phrase enlightenment means that one has carried the way into not just the way in which one sheds light on something or other to whatever degree. There is an enlightenment that is the context in which all light, however unfocused, however focused, however in between in the entire scalar, that this is then a Parayana. And the classical Parayana was in 16 delivered sermons, as they used to be called. Sermiones in Latin is the English translation, sermons of the Buddha. They are actually a kind of dialogue that is a dialogue not with the listener as they are, but with the intuited vastness of the listener with themselves. That they are hearing the enlightened one, the Buddha, in terms of dhyana that has achieved a Parayana, a way beyond whatever focus or complexity the world may offer or be, potentially or active. But that Parayana, that beyond, is actually a way across. And that way across is that there is another shore. One has left the shore, the certainty, the stability of the realm and the world that you grew up in and knew and matured to know very well, finally, or at least moderately well, that there is something that one goes to where that comes to a point, and that point disappears. But what does not disappear is the movement of that point, and that the other shore is a part of an advanced geometricity, a five-dimensional, if you will, a visionary way of giving a geometry. The quality of reminder for this is that the memory structure becomes more and more refined, more and more complex, until it achieves a master pattern that has a key. And it is that key, that symbol, as a master symbol, as a key that opens up the entirety of the memory structure. And what occurs then is that there is a spontaneous, new, fresh, conscious, differential dimension of being able to not utilize the memory, but to be engaged in creative remembering. And one of the symptoms, if you will, one of the symmetries is better, that goes with creative remembering, not the act of remembering, but the infinite field of conscious remembering. What is braided with it is creative imagining. And that creative imagining harkens back, just like the remembering harkens back to a worldly structure of complexity of the memory. Creative imagining also harkens back to the imagination. So that in the human mind, in its sophistication, in its complexity, it can be educated to achieve a maturity where one has a very clear structure of memory at the same time as a very clear structure of the imagination, where all of the images are arranged in filaments that are like image bases, that are then woven together as the fabric that is indeed the world in its memorability, in its remembering through contact of sophistication with memorizing, and this is concomitant with the ability to read images for their meaning. That quality that is there in the memory gives a tone, classically, to the way in which the divisioning of the world through its images, through the images of action, of things, of thoughts, and that this division has a structure which can be then ordered and given a quality where one can learn not only to appreciate your memory, but you can increase it. You can make it more extensive, deeper, wider, handsome. And at the same time, that in Latin it's called divisio, that division of experience. There was a great book on Shakespeare by a woman professor many, many years ago called Shakespeare's a Division of Experience. It's exactly about that. I'll bring a copy next week. The divisio is braided with and always there with, in Latin, the term is compositio. It's the composition that braids with the division, so that the memory and the imagination helps get into creative imagining at the same time that the memory has recourse to the much larger, more sophisticated quality of memory as remembering. The memory and the imagination in the limited mind can be educated. But to learn, one has to go across, one has to go beyond, so that learning is differential in its consciousness rather than integral in its education in terms of the world, in terms of the memory, in terms of the imagination, in terms of the society, in terms of your individuality, your gender, your religion, your politics, etc., etc. So that an education will help you do your job and achieve your ambitions and carry through your responsibilities, etc., etc. Whereas a little bit of learning shows that it has edges that are limits. All of them have limitations. And without pursuing learning, a little bit of learning, as the phrase goes in the world, a little bit of learning is a dangerous thing. Because if you leave off there with a little bit of learning, you tend to be able to see through other people's limitations and not your own. Other kinds of groups' limitations and not the one that you belong to. Other kinds of tribes, political parties, religions, etc., etc. Social communities, social levels, classes, genders. A little bit of learning introduces then something which has a regressive quality to it. Instead of being fed and nourished so that one continues to learn, the little bit of learning in its backsliding, its regression, not that it goes back, but that it remains a little bit. And it tends to curdle. It tends to become, first of all, becomes satiric. One can very easily turn it into a satiric comedian. crack jokes about it. Or one can become acerbic in being super critical about it. They don't even know that they're wrong, and they're all wrong, and for the same reason, etc., etc. And so, by increments, that decay, as it were, that regression, as it were, sinks. It had a little bit of flash of creative imagining, of remembering, but came back to the mind, came back to being fit into a revised version of memory, the memory, a revision and expansion, a little bit of this or that for the imagination, so that the imagery in the imagination that originally came out of the images from a mythic horizon that was a part of a natural cycle that had as its genesis the survival of life on all of its levels of complexity and development, that the actions that one would have to learn and take, be trained in, be shown, the things of the world and what one can do with them, what they are, the sense of one's individuality, one's own self, that is related intimately with one's group, whether it's the hunting group, the family group, the spatial tribal group, eventually the use of certain animals as amulets, as in totemic clans, etc., etc. All of this becomes subject to the increasing waves of distortion, of corruption, of regression. And more, what becomes important is that the education of getting along in the world is adjusted so that the majority, the powerful, the influential, are the ones who then codify through doctrines, through declarations, through arguments, through their version of the divisio, their version then of the way in which this is the way that we compose. This is the composing, the composite. The high point complexity of that in the previous age, best to use as we are using the Greek term aeon, a 2,000-year period, a pair of millennia, 4 500-year cycles of the phoenix, etc. The apex of that old age came just a couple of generations, 2 generations, a pair of generations before the new age came into play massively, but massively because it wasn't all at once evident in the world, evident to very few, but poignantly real, more real than all the complexities of the world. A learning invitation that went beyond the reigning power of educated doctrine, clans, groups, empire, because the dominant force at the time was a Roman Empire in the West, and a Han Dynasty empire in the east, and a quality of mishmash in South Asia, in India, and many competing little things together. And finally, the sense that if you're not understanding in a deep way that the paring away leads to a single pointedness, finally. And one can, in the old fashion, call it the self, or the soul, or I, with a single line with a dot at the top. Or you turn that single line with the dot at the top upside down, it becomes an exclamation mark. It is the quality that is a little bit of learning become a very complex, great learning, but not yet perfected, because it has not yet lost its I, its exclamation mark. It has still that has a final coup de grace recourse that we will be triumphant. Our group, our empire will be triumphant. One of the last educated persons in Rome who had a glimpse that it was possible that the super ego person was not the complete end-all focus. His name was one of the few. His name was Cicero. And Cicero was the most powerful lawyer in Republican Rome. A Rome that was so complex it was only a military victory away from the Roman Empire. And Cicero was the greatest lawyer because the law courts administered in the Republic the Roman law matrix. That Pax Romana was in charge of the way in which Roman law had made the structure of what was educationally important to be in the memory, what was important to be included or excluded from the imagination, and that controlled it with like two hands the way in which the division of experience and the composing of further action, or what is to be remembered and what is to be eschewed, all of this came to a graphic, tragic end for Cicero. He was completely superseded by the power of Julius Caesar, because Julius Caesar was able to bring together and marshal together a mythos, a mythic horizon that, coupled with the glory of Roman power that had spread the Republic to extraordinary ends. One of the ends was in the northern part of what was then Germany, and even began to extend the first step over what has become the English Channel into the British Isles. Never completely successful by Caesar there, but tremendously successful in Germany. And began to bring to his service the very core of the Roman Republic power, which was an extension of the Roman law. The backup was the Roman legions, the military. And Caesar was the master of military strategy in his time. It was unbeatable, unbelievable. But he not only commanded at the apex, he was the final say. He was the Caesar. Later, the German word for that was Kaiser. Hail the Kaiser. Sound familiar in the 20th century? You bet. It is a quality that is constantly lurking there at the little bit of learning that increasingly is manipulated and manufactured so that there is a little bit of learning distributed very calmly, quietly, so that the general populace cannot learn. One of the snags is that there's no limit to learning, because the field of differential consciousness in the vision of learning is infinite. It doesn't have limits. There's an appreciation of boundaries and thresholds, but not limits. The quality that comes up in later 20th century anthropology is a term that broaches upon this realization. The term is liminal. It's not about limits and therefore definitions and boundaries, etc. It's not unlimited, which is a conception that pairs itself with limit. Limit and unlimited are in Latin an opposio, an opposition. They contrast in their comparison. But the liminal is all of the in-betweens, which stretch into infinity. It is only by a mathematic that is able to access the liminal in its mathematic that delivers a most interesting transformation in civilization. And that is the realization that there is indeed a way to calculate which is not based upon measurement of limit and shying away from unlimitedness, but is accurate to whatever specificity of you want in between 0 and 1. But if you take 1 and 0, 0 the unlimited, 1 the limit of limitedness, and you pair them together, one gets a way of being pseudo-calculitic. And this is the binary that is used for computers. It is the hubris of a new age that has no idea whatsoever that the infinite liminality has a functional, workable freedom of composition and division. One can divide to any degree of specificity of micro that you want, or compose in terms of whatever macro one would like to explore. That's the original fresh basis of an interstellar civilization. So that a star wisdom humanity needs to have a moment of silence and humility where one can't recognize or identify anything, especially one's identity. And putting into a neutral gear the identification of your identity, or anybody, anything's identity, is a hiatus that spontaneously allows for fertility in an infinite field of differential conscious vision, where learning is wide open, not permanently or forever, but just simply wide open. The quality of Cicero's tragedy was that in order to show demonstratively to all people who were still thinking that they were going to live in a Roman Republic. They were going to live in a republic because that's how it was founded some 750 years before by Romulus and Remus. Given its whole structure by Numa Pompilius, and here we are, and in order to serve notice to everyone who still lived in the imaginary Roman Republic, legionnaires were sent to the villa of Cicero, and they not only murdered him, they cut off his hands. And they took those cut off hands to the Roman Senate, to the podium where one would make their speeches, and nailed those cut off hands to the podium. It so incensed those who felt this tragic denouement must be reversed. They assassinated Julius Caesar in front of the Roman Senate, many of them his closest friends, all of them stabbing him to show that as a group he was being murdered by his friends and his cohorts and so forth. Two people witnessed this with an eye towards succeeding where he had failed. The first was his right-hand man, Mark Antony. In his robust, manly, Roman Republic-bred kind of declaration that I'm the man for the job, then now that Julius Caesar has been erased, I not only step into his shoes and toga, but I will remember how that worked and I will deal with it accordingly. He begged to be killed by legionnaires on the outskirts of Alexandria when all of that went sour. He even had stepped into the bed of Cleopatra to take over from venerable Julius Caesar. The other person was his second-degree nephew, Octavian, who became Augustus Caesar, who saw to it that every aspect was covered, including making sure that the really profound mythic horizon was given a poetic structuring that would allow for a complexity that would be almost impossible for someone to not understand that it had its limitations. It had such a vast referentiality and complexity. That was Virgil in the Aeneid. But he also realized that there were, in addition to those qualities that Virgil could handle, and one of the aspects that he could handle showed a gap, a hole, a possibility, a mystery. And that was his section of the Aeneid that dealt with a visit to the Sibyl of Cumae. It was the Sibyls, those women who were related, those 9 Sibyls were related to the 9 Muses, and they were related to the kind of ancient oracles, largely brought together in a Pythagorean matrix, so that the oracle at Delphi was sort of the head of the oracles, like the Sibyl of Cumae was the head of the Sibyls, so that the 9 Muses had a head as Apollo, who was the way in which his harmonic grouped the 9 together into a composition that with him was a perfect 10. And Augustus Caesar made it under the penalty of death for anyone to have a single page of an oracle, a muse, a Sibyl that was not approved by the Roman Empire. Let's take a little break.